not on you to figure everything out, but just when you hear God speak, obey. When he presses something on your heart, obey. Hi friends, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about obedience. Obedience is the key in our walk with Christ. Obedience is the thing that makes anything count. Obedience is what God calls us to. More than anything else he's really calling us to, at the core of it, it's obedience, right? When we acknowledge that God is all-knowing, all-present, almighty, that he is everywhere at once, that he knows everything, and more than that, that he loves us deeply, that he has our best interest at heart, then we can trust God in what he says. We can trust God in what he calls us to do. But sometimes the things that God calls us to do aren't easy. Sometimes they don't seem like they are in our best interest. But the key to obedience is knowing the heart of Christ, is knowing the character of God. When you read the Bible, when you read the word, constantly the character of God is being described. He's described as good. He's described as holy, meaning set apart. He's described as faithful. He's described as loving. He's described as patient. He's described as joyful. So when we know the character of God, when we know who he is, and then we also know the characteristics of God, that one, he's God, so he's the creator of everything. He was here before the beginning of the world. He's the creator of heaven and earth, of every star in the universe, of every hair on your head he created. The word actually says he knows how many hairs are on your head. So there is a God who not only made the amount of hairs on your head, but also knows how many there are constantly. So he's all-knowing. He is the creator. He is God. So when God is God, and when we believe that God is God, and he is powerful, that he is in control, that he is sovereign, meaning that he is above all, there's nothing bigger than him. There's nothing even beside him. He is bigger than any challenge you're facing, any good thing, he's better. Any hard thing, he's bigger. He is God. He created everything, and by his will, we exist. By his will, we're still alive. Every breath we breathe, it's not our lungs doing that. It's the will of God allowing us to continue to live and to breathe. He is in control. It's who he is, but he's also good and faithful and loving and kind and gentle and sweet. And so we can trust God when he gives us a command. It's our best interest to obey that command, even when it makes no sense, even when we don't understand what God is asking us to do. And it brings us peace in our relationship with the Lord, because sometimes the Christian walk can seem extremely difficult. And why? Because we live in a fallen world. And so our flesh is full of sin, and this world is full of sin, and there's evil in the world, and our natural tendencies, what our flesh wants to do, is to live away from God, is to live in sin, to do evil, right? But when we are brought into relationship with Jesus, we have the Holy Spirit. So we now have a righteous spirit living within us that gives us the ability and the desire. Actually, now he changes our hearts, that we want and we can pursue righteousness. We can pursue the right way. We can pursue good things and holy things and perfect things. But our spirit and our flesh is constantly at war. And beyond that, we live in a supernatural spiritual world to where what is seen isn't even just what's here. There's spiritual warfare going on around us all the time. Satan is constantly fighting against the children of God and non-children of God, but especially the children of God. He wants us to suffer. He wants us to be confused. He wants to hurt us. He wants to draw us away from God. But God is still bigger. But in the midst of this, in the midst of not only our fallen nature, to where it makes it very difficult for us to want to do the things that God wants us to do, it makes it very difficult for us in our flesh to want to obey God. Beyond that, there's spiritual warfare that goes on. There's demons that are in the world that we live in that are constantly trying to feed us lies and to get us to mess up and to tempt us, right? So beyond even just our flesh, there's spiritual stuff going on that we can't see. And yet God tells us in his word how we're called to live. And he doesn't just say, you could live this way if you really are able to. He says, no, I'm commanding you to do these things that are contrary to your flesh and that seem very difficult in the world that you're living in the place that you're living in, and with the spiritual warfare that's going on, but yet I'm commanding you to do them. He's not suggesting it. He commands us to do things. He commands us to walk out of sin. He commands us to obey him. God actually commands us to do impossible things. The point of that statement is God commands us to do impossible things, but the impossible things he commands us to do are possible with God. In our own self, in our own flesh, in this fallen world, it's impossible in our own strength. But through God's strength, it's possible, meaning we actually have to depend on God to do those things. You think of a newborn baby and their mother. A newborn baby and the newborn baby needs the mother. The newborn baby can't just go feed itself and walk and live and take care of itself. It is fully dependent on its mother. And that baby and that mother, their bond grows strong, right? But imagine if God made it to where as soon as a baby was born, they could live on their own. They had full strength in their muscles. They could get up. They could go to the store. They could get what they needed. They came out of the womb with $1 billion in their pocket. Like, they were fully set. They didn't need their mother at all. Could you imagine the difference in a relationship between a baby and its mother when it's fully dependent on her versus if it just gets up and walks away? So in our own lives with Christ, are we being that newborn baby dependent on the mother? Or are we being this baby that can get up and walk away and go do its own thing and neglects that relationship with its caregiver, with its caretaker, right? We are called to be a newborn baby dependent on God, to be a child of God. We are actually allowed to be a child of God. We're allowed to be. We don't have to control everything and take control of the world around us. When God calls us to do impossible things without him, we know that he's going to show up. We know that no longer the weight relies on us. It actually is put onto God. All we have to do is be obedient, right? A baby's not called to feed itself, but it's called to be fed. All the baby has to do is receive from the mother and be fed from the mother, but the mother's the one doing the feeding. The mother's the one doing the work. So it's the same with the Lord. When the Lord calls us to obey in some area of our life, what we're called to do is to obey. We can trust that it's not even us doing most of the work, but it's really God doing it in us. And there's such peace in that, because no longer are our lives dependent on our own understanding, our own effort, our own stress, our own work. But when we live in every way surrendered to the obedience of God, every single area of our life, all we do is say, God, what do you want me to do? God, where do you want me to go? Read the word, figure out what God's heart for your life is, what God is calling you to in obedience, and to just do it and to trust him with the rest, and trust that if God's calling us to do something, there is a reason for it, and we don't have to figure it out. We don't have to understand. We don't have to know everything, but we can trust God with the results because we are his children and we get to be children. Even as adults who have to pay bills, even as adults who have responsibilities, we're still God's children. We're supposed to hear him say, walk to the right and walk to the left and walk in that way. He has our steps planned out before us. So if God knows where we're called to walk, if God knows what we're supposed to do in the big things and in the little things, then all we have to do is obey that and walk in it and see what God does with it. Hebrews 11 starts to go into detail about the story of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac. And if you don't know the story, that's okay. I'm going to explain it really briefly. But first, we're going to read Hebrews 11 through 12, which says, by faith, Sarah received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised, meaning God. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. And so the story is that a long, long time ago, there was this man named Abraham, and he had a wife named Sarah. Now, Abraham was a man who loved God and was faithful to God. And so God made a covenant promise with Abraham, basically just an agreement with him, saying that he was going to be the father of many nations, meaning he was going to be the father of many, many people. And out of this people line, Jesus was going to be born. And then Jesus was going to come down and save us. And so from the beginning of the Bible, from the beginning of the story of mankind, God already had planned Jesus to come. He already was working on the salvation story to save mankind, and he used Abraham to do it. So that's kind of like a big deal, right? But in this story, Abraham and Sarah are old. As you can see from what we just read, it describes Abraham in this way. It says, therefore, from one man, and him good as dead. So it literally describes Abraham good as dead. Like, he's so old, he's good as dead. And Sarah is way past childbearing age. Like, she cannot conceive in the natural sense. In the natural, it's completely impossible for Sarah to conceive a baby. But God gives Abraham and Sarah a promise and says, you will conceive. I will give you a child. And they're like, what? How is that even possible? And so after God gives them this promise, they're like, okay, sure, like, we believe you, right? And so they begin to walk in obedience in trusting God, right? Because trusting God can be obedience, right? We don't just always have to do something, but sometimes it's just saying, okay, God, you've said this. I trust you with it. We're just going to wait on you. We're going to wait on your timing. Wait on what you have. So that's what they were doing. They were waiting. But a few years passed, and what happened? God hadn't given them the son yet. And so they started to freak out and worry, and actually didn't obey God anymore. And they took it into their own hands. And so Sarah said, Abraham, because I'm not giving you a child, go sleep with our maidservant and ask her to give you a child. So they had maidservants in this day, and the servant, if they became pregnant and had a child with the husband of the family that they were the maidservant of, that child would belong to the husband and would belong to the family. And so Sarah's like, hey, go sleep with her so that we can have children, because then that child will belong to us. So that's what they do. And this maidservant becomes pregnant. And God is basically like, that was incorrect. You really were not supposed to do that. And it created very, very, very bad tension and very, very bad problems between Hagar, this maidservant, and Sarah, and between their children, Ishmael, and their soon-to-be child that was promised, whose name was Isaac. And so the premise of the story is that God had asked them to walk in obedience by waiting. God had asked Sarah and Abraham, saying, I'm going to make you the father of many, many, many people, more than the stars and the heavens. And what we read in Hebrews 11, as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. And so God makes them this promise, and they're called in that season to trust God with it and to wait on God. And they were doing that at first, but the moment that they stopped obeying God, huge problems came up. Huge tension was brought into the picture, and it wasn't what God was asking. When they began to try to understand things in their own mind and became worried and stressed out, they created problems. And so the same with us. When we obey God, when we trust God, it actually creates an easier life for us. We no longer have to figure things out and tell our husbands to go sleep with our maidservant so that we can get our children, and then resent the maidservant and then resent the child and then have all this bitterness and have all these feelings. Like, I know that's not a common thing that happens nowadays, I would assume, but you get the point. Like, when we start to take things in our own hands and start to try to force stuff that God's not forcing, and instead of letting God and his miraculous power move, his sovereignty, and trusting him, like, it's literally in the natural impossible for this to happen, but God. But with God, it's possible. And I'm going to trust that and obey him in the waiting. So they fail, they mess up. Okay. The beautiful thing is that once they realize, wow, we disobeyed God, we were not doing what we were supposed to be doing, that's not what God called us to do. Let us put our trust back in God. Let us trust back in the God who we call faithful, and trust him to bring to be the promise that he's given us. And so they go back to the waiting, right? It's important to know. Sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes we do take control and we don't walk in obedience with God. We're not called, well, now that you've messed up, now that you've turned away from God, just turn away forever. No, we're called to turn back, right? God didn't give up on Abraham and Sarah. God kept saying, I have a promise for you, still turn back to me, turn back and trust in me again so that I can bring to you the promise that I had given you. And that's what they did. So God ends up being faithful as he is. And Sarah gets pregnant with Isaac, right? Isaac is born. Isaac's born a healthy baby boy. Even in a barren womb, he's born a healthy baby boy because God is bigger than what we can see in our limitations of the world. We see, okay, this is physically impossible, but like I said, God calls us to impossible things. Therefore, the pressure is taken off of us because now it's God who's going to be faithful. It's God who's going to do it. It's just us who are obeying. So that's what they did. They obeyed and God was faithful. He came through and Isaac was born, this child that they promised. But get this, God calls them again to obedience and to a time of testing. People like to say, does God test us? Does God tempt us? But those are two different things. Temptation is trying to get someone to fall and to slip and to fail. Temptation is what Satan does. Testing, God does because he wants us to pass, to succeed, and to be strengthened by the test that he gives us. God does not tempt. He will never tempt us, but he will test us, and he tests us all the time. A testing period with God is called to make us stronger in our faith with God, stronger in relationship with him. And so when God gives you a test, when God is putting something in your life and he's saying, hey, can you be obedient in this? You might think, okay, does it really matter if I'm obedient in this little thing? But the Bible also says that God will not entrust you with the big things until you're obedient with the little things. And so every single little itty bitty test that God gives you, we're called to be obedient. And in the big tests too, we're called to be obedient. So what does God do next? Next in the story, God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Now you might be like, what? Why would he do that? And honestly, in the eyes of man, that really makes no sense. In the eyes of Abraham, I'm sure he was probably like, what? Like, why am I doing that? But this was a test for Abraham. Abraham could have made all these assumptions about God and said, God must hate us. God must want us to be tortured. God must hate me now. God must want to take away the blessing he's given me. Like, God must want children to be murdered. Like, he could have started making all these assumptions about the character of God that were not true. But instead he said this. He said, God is faithful and I'm going to trust in what I know about God. I'm going to trust that I've seen God be faithful in my life before. I know he's good. And so even though this actually makes no sense, I'm still going to trust God with it. Hebrews 11 verses 17 through 19 say, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And so in this story, when Abraham goes up to sacrifice Isaac, he ties him up, he puts him up on this offering table, and he goes to sacrifice him. And in that moment, God stops him. And he says, I see that you trust me. I see that you've proven to obey what I'm commanding you to do. I don't actually want you to kill Isaac. I don't actually want you to sacrifice Isaac. And provides him with a ram, an animal, instead to sacrifice the animal. So Abraham sacrifices the animal, not his son, and God sees that Abraham was faithful in that when God's not surprised. God knew this is what Abraham was going to do. But in that moment, Abraham is now aware, wow, I trusted God and this is what happens. God is trustworthy. So now Abraham has more strength, more confidence in God because of the test that he was put through and because he was obedient and because God was proven to be faithful through it all. Abraham was like, I mean, God could raise him from the dead. God can do anything. Like, why would I, in my limited understanding of the world, put my knowledge and my views above who God is? When we are faithful with the little, he is gonna give us more. He's gonna multiply that, right? And so when Abraham was faithful in the waiting, Isaac was born, right? And then God gave him more and said, okay, now Isaac's born. Are you going to be faithful to do what I'm calling you to do when you don't understand? And he was again. So when we trust in God in the same way, wonderful things will happen. And yes, for Abraham and Sarah, they had now a child. Like, that's such a blessing in it of itself. But that child led to the birth of Jesus eventually happening, to Jesus now dying and creating a way for all of us, you and me, to be saved. And so because of one man's obedience to God, we are now able to inherit eternal life. So it's a very selfless thing to obey God. But it also benefits yourself, right? When God calls us to do something, there's purpose. And we need to trust him with it because he has a mission. And in you and through you, he wants to do this mission. And so trust him with it. Let him say, God, this isn't my life anymore. Like, my life is yours. Take my life. Take my own desires, my own understanding, and throw it away and give me yours. Give me your desires. Give me your understanding, because you know better than me. I want my life to be done well and right and in perfect relationship with you, and he will tell you what to do. He will show you what to do. That's your first step of obedience, is to trust God to speak. Trust God to give you opportunities to obey him. You can pray that. Say, God, what is the next thing you're calling me to? And do it. When you trust God and you hold tight to his character, who he is, you're gonna see him be faithful. And you're gonna see miracles happen every single day. Obedience isn't just in the big things, and it's not just a one-time thing. Every single day you can walk in the obedience of God. Every single day you can have your life surrendered to Jesus and say, what do you want me to obey you in today? What do you want my day to look like today? Now, you don't have to freak out. You don't have to worry. Again, it's not on you to figure everything out, but just when you hear God speak, obey. When he presses something on your heart, obey. You don't have to figure it out. That's what Sarah was trying to do. She was like, well, I want to obey God in this, so maybe that means that actually now my maidservant has to get pregnant so that God's plan can come to be. But that's not what God was calling her to do. God wasn't calling her to figure it out. God was just calling her to wait and to trust him and to do the next thing that he was telling her to do. So that's your next step. Do the next thing that you feel God pressing on your heart. You guys are like, I don't even know what God is calling me to obey next, where to even start with obeying God in this way. Ask the Lord to speak to you as you read the word. Pick up your Bible, start to read the Bible, because the Bible is full of things where God has called people to be obedient. Look in the New Testament, look in the Gospels, look in Paul's letters, and see how we're called to live as Christians. There's going to be tons of things in there that we're called to do in obedience. Pray and ask the Lord to reveal to you which one he is putting on your heart to do, which ones you're maybe not walking in, and which ones he's asking you to do next. I hope this video helped you guys. If you liked it, please feel free to subscribe, stick around, give this video a thumbs up so I know you did. Check out some of the other videos that I made, and I will see you guys soon.